Hi there, I'd like to talk with you about list comprehensions, mapping and filtering list elements in an easy way. This is not in the book as far as I can tell, but this is so baked into the Python programming language that I thought it would probably help for you to be able to know what this is. Because if you look at other like Python books or Python code, you're going to be like, what the hell is that? And it's a list comprehension. So in this lecture, we're going to describe what mapping and filtering are. What is that problem? And then we're going to talk about how to convert our for loops for mapping and filtering into list comprehensions. And then we're also going to talk about how to do both mapping and filtering in a single list comprehension. So what is a list comprehension? This is the filtering problem. It's when you want to find a subset of values in a list that match a certain, certain criteria. So in this case, we have a list, or we have a string sentence, and we split that string and we get the words out of each sentence, and then we're going to loop over each word. And if the length of that word is longer than 6, we're going to say that's a long word, and we're going to add it to this long words list that we created up here. So we're going to add it to the end. And so what we're doing here is we're looping through a list of all the words in a sentence, and then we're applying a criterion, whether or not the length of that word is longer than 6, and if so, we're adding it to this new list. And that way our new list is only going to contain the long words. We filtered all of the short words out. We filtered it so that only the long words are in this new list. This is what's known as the filtering problem. The mapping problem is when we want to transform the elements in one list into some new values. So here we're going to create a new list called squares. And then for every number in this list of numbers here, we're going to calculate that square. We're transforming the original number into its square and then appending that to the original list. So if we have 5 numbers in it, squares will contain the 5 squares of those 5 numbers. This is as what's known as mapping, where we take a set of values inside a list and we map them or transform them into another list, not the original one, another one that has new values in it based on the original values. This is a mapping problem. So what is similar about these two types of problems? If we look, in both cases, we create a new list to hold what we want. We do that here, long words and squares. So we've created that new list to hold the results of whatever we're doing. Then we loop over the source list. In both cases, we loop over that source list to look at all of the original values. And then finally, we transform those elements and put them in the new list. And so in this case, here we're transforming it by doing squares. And in this case over here, we're finding or filtering. Here we're finding it and then adding it to the new list. So you can see that the steps are kind of the same in between both of these. Here we're creating a new list. Here we're looping over the source, the original list. On this left side, we're filtering things out and appending only things to the list that we want. And over here, we're transforming each thing and adding that to the list. As you may have figured out, most of programming is figuring out how to not do the same things over and over again. So Python has a very special syntax. It's called a list comprehension. And what it does is it sort of like turns that for loop upside down. The way that we do a list comprehension is we start with an angle bracket and we end with an angle bracket. We specify the value that we want. So in this case, we're transforming our number into the number times number. And then we have what looks like the for loop after it. The for loop comes after. So in this case, squares is a new list. It's a new list right here comprised of this calculation, num times num, for every num in numbers. This is what's known as a list comprehension. It's not just a list where we have values 1, 2, 3. It's a special kind of thing where we have this, which is value or a transformation for some variable in some list. So that's what the general syntax looks like, and you can see that here. We've got this value transformation, and then we have that for loop looking thing after it. No colon. There's no colon there. Okay, so that's what a list comprehension looks like. Let's check out some real examples. Here's the side-by-side comparison for the mapping comprehension, and we're going to go ahead and highlight these things here. So here we create the new squares list. We don't create that. Instead, we say we want a list comprehension, and then Python makes that new list for us. Up next, here is where we're appending. This is the value that we're appending to that new list. That comes first in a list comprehension. Then finally, we need to specify where those values are coming from. So for num in numbers becomes the second part of that list comprehension. So this is what it looks like when we do a list comprehension. We don't have to declare the list anymore. We just declare the variable and then this list comprehension syntax. We take the value that we're going to calculate and we put that on our first line. And then we take the for loop and we put that on the second line. Okay? So this is the mapping version of the comprehension. The filtering version of the comprehension, again, here we're declaring that brand new list. We don't do that anymore. We just say we want a list comprehension like that, and then Python will generate that new list for us. Then we have the value we want to put in that list. So that's the thing that we're going to end up appending here when it meets certain criteria. After that, we need to know where the values are coming from. So we have for word in sentence split, for word in sentence split, no colon over here. See that? There's no colon over here. And then after that, if we want to include some criteria, if the length of the word is greater than 6, we add a new optional clause here in our list comprehension. So this is the filtering version. You can see right here, we're not actually, the mapping that we're doing, we're just using the original value. Later on, we'll see an example of where we can do everything all at once. And then we put our for loop on the second line, just like on the last one. And then we put our if loop after that, if we have an if. So this is what the list comprehension looks like for this loop over here. You can see that it has almost all of the same code. But this thing over here on the right side, this list comprehension, Python programmers love this. They love this syntax. Rather than using the colons and all of this indentation and stuff, they just write it simply as a list comprehension. So here's an example of both at the same time, both filtering and transformation. So let's go ahead and take a look. On the left-hand side here, we have our list of numbers, and it goes from -2 to +3, -2 to +3. Then we create a new list called absolute even. So we only want even numbers, and we want their absolute value. So down here at the end, we'll have 202, because we'll take the absolute value of -2 and turn that into 2. -1 is not an even number, so we'll ignore it. 0, we'll take the absolute value of that, which is a 0. 1 is not an even number, so we'll ignore it. 2 is an even number, so we'll take the absolute value. 3 is not an even number, so we'll ignore it. And that's how we end up with 202 as our answer. That's what we're looking for. We want to find the absolute value of all the even numbers. So not only are we transforming things, like from -2 to 2, we're also filtering things. We're saying only let the even numbers pass. Okay, so with all that in mind, our code on the left-hand side, it looks like this. We create that new destination array, our new destination list. It's empty. Then we loop over each of the numbers. Then if the number is even, and we test that with the modulo operator, which is to say if we take this number and divide it by 2, we want the remainder to equal 0. That means it's an even number. Then we calculate a new value by using the built-in absolute function, and then we append it to that list. So you can see we are both filtering right here and mapping right here. We're filtering only the even numbers and we're mapping it to the absolute value. So let's take a look and see what that looks like over on the right-hand side. We'll start off with both of the number, the original array or lists are the same. So here we're declaring a new list. Over here, we declare a new list comprehension because it's got that for crap inside it. Up next, here's what's the calculation that we're doing? We're taking the absolute value of that number, and that's what we're doing right here, the absolute value of that number. Then what we're doing is we're doing that loop. Where's the source coming from? So for num in nums, for each number in that list of numbers. And then finally, we're using that filtering clause at the end there. We're saying if that number modulo 2 is equal to 0, if it's an even number. So you can see the thing on the right basically has all of the same code on the left. It's just in a more compact, idiomatic, Pythonic form. Pythonic is a word used by programmers to say that's like Python code. So again, our calculation goes on the first line. Our second line is the loop that we're going to be doing, but no colon. And then the third line, if we have it, is a condition, no colon, if we have one. Out in the wild, Python programmers like writing these things on one line if it's not a really long line. So instead of using like num for this, they'll use just the letter n, and they'll just put it on one line like this. So what this is saying, the way that we read this, and this is why Python programmers like it, because for them, it's easier to read. For us, it's easy to read. So what's going to be in this list comprehension? Well, it's going to be the square of some number. And where's that number coming from? It's coming from each of the numbers in the nums list. So for me, I know what's going to be in it because that's the first thing that's listed. It's n times n. Down here, what am I looking at? Okay, I'm just looking at W, some W for W in sentence split. Okay, so it's going to be a word or whatever. So for each of those words, all I'm going to do is get that word. Then way down here, it says if the length is greater than 6. So in this case, what I'm saying is I want the word. So in this case, what I'm saying is I want all of the words from the sentence split if the length of the word is greater than 6. And here's that absolute even one. Here I'm saying I'm going to take the absolute value of n, and then that comes from nums, and then only if n is an even number. So I'm only going to have absolute values in there from this list, and here's that clause. I know it's going to be even numbers. And in some cases, we can transform it to a different data type. So everything we have here, if nums contains a list of numbers, squares is going to contain a list of numbers. Here, sentence.split is going to contain a list of strings. Long words will be strings. Here, we're taking the absolute value of numbers, and so this will be numbers. In this case here, we're taking each number in n and we're converting it to a string. And now num strings is going to be a list of strings. So it'll be a list of strings here, which originally came from a list of numbers. We took a list of numbers and transformed it or mapped it into a list of strings using the string operator. So that's kind of pretty cool right there. So again, a list comprehension is just idiomatic Python. It's Pythonic code that allows us to map and filter a list into another list. That's all it does. And then Python programmers use them extensively rather than for loops when all they have to do is transform or filter a list. If they have to do anything else besides transform or filter a list into another list, they'll actually write a for loop. But if all they're doing is like changing the values into other values and putting them into another list, you will see them being using list comprehensions a lot. So use list comprehensions if you want to, if you feel to. In one of the homework assignments, you get points for it. So have a think.